My name is Roger Berkowitz, and I'm the founder and academic director of the Hannah Arendt Center here at Bard College. Today, we continue with our virtual reading group. We continue to discuss Hannah Arendt's first book, the book she wrote while writing her Habilitation in Germany, Rahel Varnhagen, The Life of a Jewess. We're very much nearing the end of the book, and we've really focused, I think, our attention on a number of themes: private and public. What does it mean to have a private life? And that's a question that really this book is obsessed with. Today, I want to review a little bit the last two chapters because I think they lead into and make possible understanding the current two chapters we're discussing, which are chapters 10 and 11, Bankruptcy of a Friendship and Civil Improvement, Story of a Career. So we've really entered the sphere of her life in which she meets and eventually marries August Varnhagen, and this is a difficult time in her life. But I want to review. I want to start up, and I'm going to try and do this pretty quickly, but get us there. To me, you have to go back to chapter 8, the chapter Day and Night, and this conflict between day and night, which Arendt develops in reading about Rahel Varnhagen in chapter 8, is essential to understanding what we're reading in chapters 10 and 11. To recall, in chapter 8, Arendt says that for Varnhagen, she realized that to live in daily life as a Jew, to live in daily life as someone who was poor and disadvantaged and outside of society, you needed lies. You couldn't live without lies. So you had to dominate daily life through lies. That there was unhappiness in daily life, which you could conceal but not erase. And that as a result of her recognition of the unhappiness and the need for lies in daily life, Rahel Varnhagen, developed fantasies, dreams, a dream world that offered her all that she could not find and provide in the day world. The dreams that she had made her realize that she had banished all that was important to her from her day life, that the way she had made peace with the life that she could live was by, in a sense, accepting something middling and making peace with it. And she banished what was important from the day life, and it became part of her dream life, her fantasy life. She banished her dreams to what she called the night. And only the night for Rahel revealed the true depths of her soul, her secrets, all that the day had tried to circumvent. I'm just quickly reviewing this chapter. And then at the very end of the chapter, Arendt says, but the more that the day had hidden, and the more that the day thus hid what was true and what was deep and profound in Rahel's life, the more defenseless the day was against the deceptions of the night. Even though she tried to hide it, even though she tried to hold back and live a day life, she couldn't in the end. She needed the night. And that's the introduction. That chapter is sort of the transition in the book from all the earlier chapters to now her life in and around August Varnhagen, who she meets in chapter 9, which is called The Beggar by the Wayside, which we discussed, I think, pretty well last time. But just to review quickly, August Varnhagen is 14 years younger. He's empty. He's a nothing. And she was a failure. But at least she had a soul and she had depths. Varnhagen was largely, as he calls himself, a beggar by the wayside. He had no, he had nothing, he had no depth, and he was empty. And he needed her, or someone like her, to live through. And so he glorified her, because by glorifying her, with whom he was, he made himself better. And she at some point explains to him that he has to choose. He has to either love her or leave her. And to her surprise, he understands that that's a necessary choice, and he chooses to stay with her, to love, to if not love her, at least stay with her. And he does it for rational reasons. He understands her need for him and his need for her, and it's a transparent kind of almost utilitarian relationship. He needs someone like her to live through, and she needs someone like him, A, to tell her story because she can't tell it herself, and B, because she needs, in the end, a husband to enter the world. And his rationality and his understanding, Arendt says, humanized her. Her life became a story that made sense, that she could tell and he could preserve. She educated him to tell her story. She was the older lover and he was the younger lover. But she was compelled to hold back something. She was compelled to hold back her nightlife from him, her secrets, because that's what couldn't be simplified. And if she had told him everything and sought to have him understand everything, she would have lost something essential to herself, which is that which is not understandable, that which is not reducible to being understood. And that is what Arendt and her, Rahel, call the night. And that she talks about that, what's held back on page 204 in the book most of you are using, 127 in my edition. I assume there's other editions as well running around, but those are two. So that brings us to the two chapters that we actually read for this week, which we'll get to talk about, and I hope you guys will want to talk a lot about them. The fascinating chapter 10, which begins on either, again, 128 in my edition or 205 in the other edition, is called Bankruptcy of a Friendship. And it's about her friendship now with another man, Alexander von Marwitz, who is a noble, and he's someone who is experiencing the rise of the Enlightenment and the death of the nobility. And his reaction is utter alienation, detachment, boredom. He's drowned by his boredom. He's repelled by all of humanity. And his attitude he takes in the face of the loss of the world of the aristocracy and the rise of the bourgeois and the enlightened liberal mentality is contempt. Contempt for those who, don't understand the beauty of depth and simply want money or prestige or success and think it can be bought or think it can be acquired. He has contempt for those who care about money, who care about success and material things. And he sees himself as better than them. And this contempt that he has, Nietzsche talks about the pathos of difference in his work, the idea that one of the core elements of what it means to be human is to feel oneself better, to feel oneself higher. And Marwitz has this pathos of difference. And the reason he's so important for Rahel is that he taught her the value of contempt. This is an idea that we can talk about. I'd love to hear your thoughts on it, because I think it's one of the more controversial and yet powerful ideas that Arendt brings up here. I mean, on the one hand, she's simply reflecting what Rahel says, but I think Arendt is to a large degree sympathetic to this need for contempt, this need for the pathos of difference. And Marwitz, faced with the declining world of distinction and judgment, taught Rahel that there was another reality, namely the old world of nobility. And he gave her access to that, which she'd only had from the outside. She'd never had someone fully express this contempt and this hate for the Enlightenment, this hate for the bourgeoisie, hate for what he hated Varnhagen, right? Who was at this point her lover. And he thought of Varnhagen, she says, I think on page 208 or 209 in most of your editions, 133 in my edition. He saw Varnhagen as a middle-class intellect of the Enlightenment, and he saw him as vulgar. And we're told that Rahel shared his contempt for Varnhagen, her lover. And yet she didn't want to give him up. And she told, and then the other important element here on page 134, or I think 209, 208, 209, is that she told Marwitz, and Marwitz is the only one of her friends that she tells about her idea of the night. This goes back to chapter 8 that I was talking about before. She tells him about her love of the night. Why? Because if Marwitz has a contempt for liberal Enlightenment bourgeois society, what she has contempt for in the end is the day. She has contempt for the sacrifices, the compromises, the getting by. And she wants the passion of the night. And so what he does is he doesn't teach her to share his contempt for the he doesn't teach her to share his contempt for the bourgeoisie or for the Enlightenment. She actually still wants to become a bourgeoisie. She wants to become enlightened. She wants that success. But what he teaches her is the value of contempt and gives her the language to express her contempt for middling individuals, middling people, for the day. And so what he teaches her is depth, or a love for depth and complexity and nuance, a depth of feeling. And in doing that, Arendt says that he may have been the only person who ever actually saw her as an equal in a world of unequals. That she and he, in a way, became simpatico, became partners who saw themselves above other people, who saw themselves as different. And yet, and here's the key, their differences were different, right? For him, what he had contempt for was the Enlightenment and the bourgeoisie, but actually what she wanted more than anything else was to enter the enlightened bourgeoisie. And the way Arendt expresses this difference is, to me, the most important and interesting passage of this whole chapter. I think one of the most interesting passages of the whole book. And it's on page 138 in my edition and page 214 in the edition that I believe most of you are using. And it's the passage where she says, Roger, I am fair.
Roger, your page now. Roger,
your paragraph that begins, fairness was not a quality with which Marwitz was directly familiar. Now, Roger, I was really skeptical of this passage. It didn't make any sense to me when I read it. And so I went to the German, and the word for fairness in German that's translated as fairness is actually not fairness. It's a terrible translation. It's Gerechtigkeit, which means justice. And just to be all clear, fairness is not the same thing as justice. Justice is a middling idea. It's like the idea of the day. Justice is, fairness, we think of in baseball. Some of you know I'm a big baseball fan. In baseball, fairness is a fair ball. It's not too far to the left, not too far to the right. It's sort of in the middle. In Old English, the actual derivation of fair is not ugly. The original etymology of fair is it was a woman, a fair maiden, is someone who was homely, not too pretty, but also not too ugly, sort of in the middle. And but justice, Gerechtigkeit, is a grand idea. It's the idea of all that is right in the world, gerecht, that which is made right. And what Arendt is here saying about Rahel is that what she dreamed of was justice. That each person would be judged on their own, and that each person would have the ability to enter the world and be taken seriously on their own terms and face value. And so her dream is not contempt for the world, but actually a contempt that allows you to enter the world and be taken seriously as a person. And because she therefore looked to the future, a world of justice, whereas he looked to the loss of the past, they ended up unable to maintain their friendship, and they broke their solidarity. And that's the end of the chapter. There's a beautiful discussion of their metaphors about the mountain and the green veil. In a way, she wanted to live in the green veil, in the grass and the valleys, but she wanted the valleys to be fertilized and just. He wanted to stand up way up high on the mountain, and raised above everyone and look down on everyone and have contempt for them and sort of be alone. And she couldn't do that. She wanted and needed to be still in the world. Brings us to chapter 11, Civil Improvement, A Story of a Career. And this is the chapter in which she basically makes her decision not to try and live a life like Marwitz, and not to choose someone like Marwitz. In a sense, not to choose the night, but to choose the day. She was 40. She was old. It's a very sad statement. She was left with nothing. And basically, she had no dowry. She had no money after her mother had died. And her only chance at creating a life in which she could find some stability was to marry Varnhagen. And she does. She bets on him, and in a way the bet pays off insofar as he slowly but surely becomes a successful bourgeois middling journalist and middling military person, and she is entered into society at a low level, but at least entered into society to some degree. There's a lot we can talk about more in this chapter. I'm happy to do it, but I just wanted to. I think that gets us to a large extent where we needed to go as a beginning. So why don't I open it to discussion from here? I know it's a holiday and we have a small group today, so I hope you guys will participate vibrantly and excitedly. So I think there's a couple of questions in the chat. We can start with those, and we will move on. Unless there's any direct comments on what I just said, I'm happy to take questions or comments on what I just said. Daphne, I think you may be talking, but
yeah, can you hear me?
Not with a mic.
Can you hear me?
Are you trying to say something?
Can you hear me?
Your mic on?
I think it's on.
Oh, go ahead. Now I can hear you. I had my sound down. Go ahead.
Your page numbers are very confusing because I don't know which edition you're talking about. If it's this edition, it wasn't the same pages.
Well, I was trying to give that edition.
Well, you were using two pages. I looked at both, and neither were relevant. So I don't know which.
Yeah. Okay. I was using that one. The one. That one. Yeah, and this one, which is the first edition.
Well, in this one, it corresponds to nothing, but I think I figured out where you were talking about. I
apologize. Unfortunately, there's just so many. I didn't realize there was a third edition. I only thought there were two editions. So I apologize. Yeah, there's too many editions of this book. I hate when that happens. I will do my best now to use paragraph and page numbers, as we have all said. I was trying to actually be good. Any other comments, questions, or thoughts? Well, we can think about them. So Daphne, you had asked, human beings are mortal, double so in wartime. That has to be your favorite line. Okay. It's on page 192 in your edition in chapter 11. If anyone can find it in the other chapters, that would be good.
I think it's paragraph 34.
Okay. What does the paragraph begin with? Do you know? Daphne, what does the paragraph begin with? What's the first sentence?
In Rahel, this adaptation took place far more slowly. In Rahel, this adaptation.
Okay. Oh, I see it. It's on page 156 in my edition. Probably about 225 in the other edition. So
I just like her whole attitude towards Varnhagen's going to war and the whole concept of patriotism and whether she's now suddenly a German. That whole I don't know, that whole discussion was very intriguing. And I don't know if this is her line or his line, but human beings are mortal, double so in wartime really struck me. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think it's her line. And I think you're right. The question of, I mean, so what they both came to understand to a certain degree is that patriotism required or was a way of accessing assimilation, right? So we've read about assimilation, but the next chapter we're really going to read about it. The chapter called Between Pariah and Parvenu. I mean, she's going to identify both Rahel and August Varnhagen as parvenus, people who want to make it in society and are willing to give up who they are in order to make it, and that's the sacrifice that they're both willing to make. One of the really beautiful passages in this, I'm gonna talk about what you've just said about the war, but one of the beautiful passages is when she talks about how Heinrich and others in this first generation of assimilation were able to assimilate, get baptized, become non-Jewish, and yet maintain a love and care for those without power. So this is on page 144 in my edition, 220 in the other edition I have page numbers for, and it's the paragraph that begins this blind spot. It's about the fourth paragraph or sixth or seventh paragraph of chapter 11. This blind spot seems incomprehensible when we examine the biographies of the generations of Jews who came after her. After Heinrich Heine and Ludwig Borna, the best among the assimilated Jews never lost their awareness of necessary solidarity with the underprivileged in general. They inevitably shared the fate of certain movements, took part in certain revolts. But to Rahel, with her still unblemished, enlightened concept of the certainty of progress, from which would come reform and a reshaping of society, all struggle was alien. The important thing was to get into this society, which was already progressing, for as she saw it, only in this society was it possible for one to be historically effectual. This is one of my favorite passages because it's Arendt's real expression of her contempt for the parvenu. Rahel was a parvenu because all she wanted was progress, at least in her day life, right? In her desire to succeed and enter society, which is what she calls succeeding in the day. I think one of the reasons Arendt finds Rahel so fascinating and so compelling is because despite the parvenu tendencies of her and her day life, she has this other side, this night life, that remains, that deepens her and makes her interested. In any case, we can come back to that, and we'll certainly talk about it more next week when we talk about the pariah and the parvenu. But this idea that patriotism was one way to assimilate, and even though she ends up embracing patriotism, and even though she ends up, volunteering for the war effort or for helping with the war effort, she still understands the problems with it, the other side, the ambiguities, and this is the line that Daphne quotes: "Human beings are mortal, doubly so in wartime." So in spite of all these years of preparation, namely preparation for what? For assimilation, patriotism as such was still as foreign to her as it had been at the beginning. She was once again living entirely within her family in utter naivete, because she had no idea of all that was involved. She did not conceal her true mind, though shortly afterwards, but only for the duration of the war, she yielded at last to the pressure of public opinion and hastily revised it. That opinion was that we are called and are Germans as a matter of chance, and of the inflated making much of this will end with the bursting of the whole volley. So yes, I do. I think these are wonderfully important lines. Anything you want to say more about that, Daphne, or anyone else?
Well, she said it in response to, I think, or in continuation to Fichte's address to the nation to the German nation that he made. And this was a whole period where the idea of patriotism and the German folk and the idea of patriotism was grand, and yet she fully understands that the fact that we're called Germans is a matter of chance. I kind of like that, because what she's basically not sure about is she really German? And if all of the things that she learned from Marwitz had to do with feeling superior to the vulgarity of the common man, and yet here we are inspiring patriotism where the people in the trenches are not just going to be the nobility, but everybody. And we're all going to rise together, and we're all going to sing patriotic songs. And when we sing the Star-Spangled Banner, we are so moved emotionally that we're willing to die for one another. I think that element in her is very conflicted. And I like that particular conflict, because the rest of the time, I don't understand why she is so obsessed with rising or climbing in the social ladder. I feel that that's kind of her main concern. So this particular paragraph struck me as Rahel at her best, maybe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this why Rahel is concerned with rising or climbing. Well, this is Arendt's view of the parvenu. Rahel was born with no advantages. She was Jew. She was poor. She had depth, but not real intelligence. This is Arendt's telling. She had no way in, and the only way in, and one of the interesting things is all of her friends got into society, right? This is what Arendt says at the beginning of this chapter, which was sort of fascinating. All of her Jewish friends succeeded. So this is on page 219 or 143. It's paragraph 3 of chapter 11, so the first page of chapter 11. All her women friends, who had come from the same background and who wanted to escape from Judaism, had succeeded. Frau von Grotus und Frau von Eibenberg, Dorothea Schlegel und Henriette Herz, and her sister Rose and Rebecca Friedländer, all of them had married. If Germans, their husbands had been noblemen, so they were brought into society. If Jews, their husbands were rich businessmen and had a place in the world. All of her friends succeeded. Why didn't Rahel? Why didn't she succeed? Well, I mean, she was plain looking. She was fair, to use the term Arendt uses at the beginning of the book. She was poor. But Arendt gives a different reading of it here. The main reason she didn't succeed is because she lived in the night. She couldn't just go along and be a happy wife. She wanted more than that. And so in the next in 2 paragraphs after that, where the paragraph that begins, there was no doubt, Arendt writes, there was no doubt that assimilation by marriage could succeed, but not when a woman acted as Rahel did again and again, though with no conscious will. By transmuting the attempt to assimilate, the effort to climb and to set one's house in order, into a love affair. If you want love, you're not going to succeed in assimilating, right? Because assimilation is not about love. It's about finding the right person. And she kept finding lovers rather than husbands. And not when a woman intensified the already existent insecurity of the Jewish situation by deliberately adding the insecurity of a life dedicated to self-exposure. Rahel wanted to be seen as who she was. And there's no greater danger to success in society than wanting to be seen as who you are. Because what does society want? It wants conformism. It wants you to be who you're supposed to be, not who you are. And so it's Rahel's demand for love, for passion, her demand for the truth of who she was, to be seen, and thus her unwillingness to make the compromises, the lies of the day life, her highest goal that leads her to fail in assimilation and fail in finding a good husband. She wants that. She wants to rise to the level of parvenu, Arendt says. And she was a parvenu, and she was not one of the best people of her generation, because she, unlike Heine and unlike Ludwig Borna, she didn't have a solidarity with the pariah. She was willing to give the pariah up. She was willing to give that part of herself that was a pariah up, as long as all the other pariahs. But what she wasn't willing to do was to live untrue to herself. And that's why, in the end, she failed, whereas so many of her friends succeeded.
Roger, can I jump in for a second?
Yeah.
So I want to just kind of building off of that. And I think it's important to, as we start to reach the end of the book, I've been thinking more about the context in which Arendt was writing this as she was studying German Romanticism. And this book, in many ways, is really Arendt's critique of Enlightenment thinking and Romanticism, which she understands to have played a significant role historically in the emergence of Nazism and totalitarianism, precisely by the ways in which German Romantic thinking emphasized a form of individual reflection, a certain form of thinking about the self. And so it's not, I mean, it is about Rahel's many failures here, and those are material examples of, I think, the greater societal failing of Romanticism in Germany. But it's really this kind of night, which, you know, is a great metaphor in Romantic poetry. The darkness, the night, becomes the reflective space of the individual soul. The man on the mountain, the famous, you know, Friedrich Casper painting, staring off into the sea and the valley. All of these kind of reflective images are world denying, for Arendt. This kind of subjectivity, this kind of individualism is flattening of plurality, which is, I think, comes out on the other end in Arendt's definition ultimately of the pariah, and affirming one's individual self. Rahel can't actually affirm herself as an individual because she's engaging in this kind of petty, romantic narcissism of the self that Arendt's describing here. And because she's constantly engaged in this, people take that to be her uniqueness as an individual being in the world. But I think part of Arendt's point, and this, just the language, I was so struck by at the top of, in chapter 11, she's alone, she's failed at everything, she's old, she succeeded at nothing. So that this is, it's really this kind of, it's Arendt showing us the shallowness of one of the greatest intellectual movements in the 18th and 19th centuries, and trying to, I think, illustrate through the figure of Rahel Varnhagen what kind of society that form of thinking leads to. And it's not, so Rahel's failure, I started to come to read in this chapter, is also, it's the failure of society at the time to think about the individual in relationship to the other. The assimilation is the emergence of the social, and Rahel's making public of everything private is part of that collapse between the private and the public realm that Arendt is going to be so important for her in her later work.
Are there other thoughts or comments?
I just want to say that really helped me. Thanks, Sam.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Anyone else? Jennifer has a question. The idea of contempt is interesting to me in terms of where we are today, with liberal opinions of contempt for people who don't live on the coasts. I used to think that was wrong until I realized people in the middle of the country have contempt for us, in my case, Californians. Well, I think you're right that both those ideas of contempt are there. So the question then becomes, Jennifer, is contempt something we want to have in society? In a way, it's an anti-Republican. I'm using a Republican in the little r sense, or it's an anti-democratic Republican idea. If you go back to Montesquieu, who understood that there were, in forms of government, there was the nature of the government and the principle of the government. What Montesquieu said is that in a republic or a democracy, a democratic republic, the nature of it is that everyone is equal. The power is structured equally, and the principle is one of virtue, a love of equality, a love of putting the commonweal above the individual interests, and that in order for a democracy or a republic to succeed, you have to there has to be a civic virtue, or a virtue that puts the whole above the individual, and that's the only way a republic can succeed. But a monarchy, Montesquieu says, is very different. A monarchy is where one person or a few people rule, and in that kind of world, those few people have to be constrained by society, by a view of themselves. And so the principle of a monarchy is distinction, even vanity. It's the need for being seen as good. And only if the monarch or the few aristocrats who rule care about being seen as good, and therefore try and act in that way, will they govern well. so this idea of contempt is an aristocratic / monarchical idea, and it's not an accident that the proponent of it here is an aristocrat, Mr. Marowitz, whose brother, we learn, was one of the great defenders of the aristocracy against democracy and the bourgeoisie. And so, one thing to, so Nietzsche, who, we can have mixed opinions about his views of democracy, but Nietzsche believes that there's a deep need for a pathos of difference, a feeling of distinction. And Rahel also is someone who comes to feel the need for distinction. On the one hand, she wants to enter society, and yet she's someone who sees herself as better than and more than most other people. So I raised the question. I think it's actually the most interesting question of the readings for today. If we don't have distinctions and we see everyone as equal, it's very hard to make judgments. And this is, if Arendt has a critique of democracy, and she certainly does, which is not to say she's anti-democratic, she's quite democratic. But if she has a critique of it, it's that in democracy, we don't make distinctions. We refuse judgments. We are afraid of making judgments, of being seen as arrogating to ourselves, the arrogance to make a judgment. And as most of you know, Arendt got into trouble throughout her life, whether it was around Eichmann or around the Little Rock School case or others, because she made judgments about people. And she said the Jewish leaders were wrong to cooperate with the Nazis. And Eichmann was evil, but his evil was banal, not malignant. Discrimination is wrong as a public idea, but is okay and necessary in the social. And she was willing to make judgments that set her outside of society, that set her as different. And she thought that was absolutely necessary. And yet there's no doubt that it stands opposed to the overriding demand for equality and lack of distinction. That is at least one element of much liberal, democratic, bourgeois thought. So thought maybe people might have something to say about that. Is that clear or not? Silence.
Well, I want to say something, but it's kind of, it's a lot to process. But when you mentioned the thing about Contempt and Marowitz and that time in the Enlightenment, all I could really think about was these oligarchical elements in our society that are not only political, but social. And what you were just talking about, were people thinking they're better than others, this idea that you could pay to get your kid into the best school because it's a product and not a process. And you have this desire to be seen. It's a vanity thing. And I equated that whole thing with the getting into USC and paying for your kid with issues of political issues happening right now. And I don't really have much more to say about that, but these things are kind of swirling around in my head when you were talking about Marowitz and that issue.
Mm-hmm.
This similarity there.
Yeah, I'd have to think a little bit. So the people who are paying to get their kids into school, I'm not sure if I think of them as having contempt. I mean, I think they have money and they want social they want their kids to socially succeed, and they're willing to break the laws to do so. I'm not.
But doesn't that fly in the face of having a sense of a republic and having a sense
Oh, I
that
don't think they're Democrats or Republicans, little R Republicans, but I don't think they're monarchs either. I think they are. I mean, they certainly don't care about their reputation in the sense. I mean, their reputations are ruined. I mean, they're also going to go to jail, a number of them. So I wouldn't put them on the side of the aristocracy or the monarch. I'd put them on the side of the parvenu, the bourgeoisie, who wants to rise and is willing to break the rules in order to do so. Sort of like the mafia or the mob in Arendt's telling of it in Origins of Totalitarianism.
When you see,
you go ahead, someone else, because I was going to say a thing, but
it's me again. It's Daphne again.
Hi, Daphne.
When the nobility has been replaced by an economic class, which means everything can be bought, and so now the people who are striving to reach the upper echelons of that particular nobility are people who feel entitled to buy. What we see is, again, a total different concept of democracy, which may not have been one that Arendt or most of us would approve of necessarily. And it's interesting because Marwitz's big thing was he tried to teach her to disapprove of vulgarity. And vulgarity is exactly what we're seeing in the rise of the moneyed classes without any reverence for, let's say, what's good and beautiful and noble, whereas some of the nobility of the past certainly had certain traditions. And the image that I have in my mind that I can't get rid of is Notre Dame burning and Trump building a wall. I can't get rid of that image, but I think that that's the difference, is that now we have a different kind of nobility, and it's not the same nobility, and basically nobility has lost its meaning.
Oh, I think that's exactly right, and I mean, and I think what first of all, the idea that Marwitz had contempt for the businessmen is absolutely right, and I should say that to a large degree, Arendt does too. I mean, I don't want to say completely, but there's certainly in the chapters of Origins of Totalitarianism where she's talking about the alliance between the intellectuals and the mob. I mean, she has really negative things to say about the bourgeoisie businessmen who basically act like criminals or the mafia, and want to think of themselves as respectable and buy respectability, but are vulgar and corrupt. So I mean, the people buying entry for their kids into college, or the businessmen who avoid taxes, or the businessmen who bribe or who give donations in order to get, something. These are for her vulgar, and these are the kind of acts and people that need to be judged contemptuously. But in a society in which we're afraid of judgment, and this is a theme that runs through Arendt's work, the fear of judgment. Why are we afraid of judgment? One reason for her is sort of the rise of science, the idea that we have to make we have to constantly find reasons for everything, and once you find reasons, there's rationalities and rationalizations, and we can always sort of equivocate. But the bigger reason for her is the rise, the loss of this pathos of difference, the loss of a sense of distinction. We all want to be seen as equal. Who has the capacity or the right to judge? And judging requires standing out and stating an opinion that is not true, but you think is right, and you want to claim is true, but without any scientific validation. And so people are afraid of it, and they are afraid of making that kind of judgment because it risks who they are. And so she takes the lack of judgment and the fear of judging to be a big part of what enables things like the Holocaust, but also what enables. I saw that Charles Van Doren recently died, the guy from Quiz Show fame. The fact that people didn't simply roundly condemn him, she found to be, again, an example of a loss of the power and the capacity to judge today. And what she likes about both Rahel and Marowitz is that they can and do judge. They have a certain kind of willingness to express contempt. Now, someone said earlier, I think it was Jennifer, right, that we're seeing the rise of contempt on the left and the right, on the coasts and in the middle, and that there's this whole new culture of contempt. Some of you know that I've been writing a lot about Matt Taibbi's new book on hate, and what he would say is that we've entered a sphere in which hate has become the coin of the realm. Daniel Ziblatt, in his book on How Democracies Die, writes about how one of the things that kept American democracy alive for so long was our toleration of different opinions, and that even if people got elected who we really hated, we understood that they were part of the system and part of the country. And he thinks that one of the signs of our democratic demise or potential democratic demise is the rise of this hate and contempt. And I think there's truth to that too, because democracy does mean respecting and having tolerance for people who are not as good or noble or as insightful as yourself. And yet, if democracy simply becomes without contempt, it will become corrupted and die. So there's this, I think, in Arendt's work, and this is an aspect of Arendt that I think could be worked on much more. There's a delicate balance. On the one hand, she's a Democrat. She believes that everyone has the right and should and can participate and appear in public and be part of the public sphere. On the other hand, she's an elitist. But she's an elitist not as an aristocratic elitist, not as an elitist by birth or by money, but she believes that there are people who love appearing and acting in the public sphere and people who don't. And her elitism is one of people who love doing it and are good at it, doing it and rising up from the bottom and becoming the leaders, the political leaders of the country. Not because of who they were born as or how much money they have, but because they are good at doing it. And it's absolutely imperative that we have a public space where people can act in public and perform and be seen. And when we like what they do, we elevate them. And that is how we elect leaders, through our judgments about them. And so I think that's in some ways the way Arendt negotiates this very tricky line between democracy and aristocracy on the one hand, and between equality and distinction on the other. Anyone want to add to that? Respond to it? Ask about it?
I'll just say, she is quite critical of the bourgeoisie. I think not just, I mean, I would take it just a little further than you did at the beginning. Here it comes out, I think the beginning of her critique of the bourgeoisie as a class that becomes isolating. But also, if we look at her work, Arendt's work on culture and politics, and I think it's in the chapter on the social question and on revolution, she talks pretty blatantly about the ways in which the bourgeoisie, the aristocratic class in the United States, leads to social isolation, the flattening of culture, the erasure of plurality, and is harmful to democracy. And I think that's a different kind of contradiction in her understanding of elitism, I want to say. She's very, we've never had a monarchical society in America. What we have is a class society. And she's very critical of the ways in which class leads to social stratification and the ways in which the, consumer society specifically erases distinctions between the haves and the have-nots, so that everyone comes to define themselves through buying things, through consumer culture. And I think that comes out in like 180, 181 in the Rahel text in the volume that I have here, when she's talking about how it was only the rich Jews who could buy their way into assimilation.
Yeah, well, that's actually a good transition, because Jennifer has a question about that. Connell says, do I think criminals are contemptuous of the people they damage? I would say so, yes. But let's go to Jennifer's question. Can we discuss the paragraph on 221 or 145, which begins, assimilation existed exclusively for well-to-do Jews? For those of you who are not on either of those editions, it's probably the third page of chapter 11, third or fourth page. Assimilation existed exclusively for well-to-do Jews. The rest entered the European public's field division only when they too rose into the affluent class and assimilated.
179.
On what page?
179 in the other edition.
179 and 221 and 145. Otherwise, they were known only as comic sheet figures, caricatures, objects of the most vulgar kind of anti-Semitism. In the eyes of their prosperous co-religionists, the mass of poor Jews were already no more than an object of philanthropy, at best of reformist endeavors, whose ultimate goal remained the elimination through reform of these dangerous and regrettable provokers of anti-Semitism. So, I mean, this is for those of you who've read a fair bit of Arendt, this is a widespread view in her work. But the basic premise here is that it's the well-to-do Jews that can and do have access to assimilation. They're the ones who get educated, can speak German well, or English, depending on your place, can become objects of interest in the sense that they are smart because they work hard in order to get ahead, and therefore they become, brilliant or exciting, and they attract people to them, and they become and they gain a certain entry into society, and so you need a certain privilege, whether it's not purely economic, because you can also have professors or educated Jews who assimilate, even if they don't make a lot of money, or artists. But it is about privilege and some sort of a way of entering into and being accepted in the general society. poor Jews, and I'm going to stick with Jews for a second, and I'm going to expand it in a minute. But poor Jews, in the shtetl, uh, don't have access to that, and they are seen by both the nobility and the bourgeoisie, but also by other Jews as dirty and greedy, and they don't shower. All the stereotypes that we all know about poor shtetl Jews, and they're a problem because they keep anti-Semitism alive. They make it easy to say this is what a Jew is, and the problem is that the parvenu, the assimilated Jews, are caught in a bind. On the one hand, they need to deny that they're Jewish because they want to assimilate and they don't want to be dirty and greedy and whatever. And yet they can never escape it because they'll always be seen as a Jew, because this is what a Jew has become, the Jew in general. I just want to add that I think there's a really compelling case to be made that you can expand Arendt's analysis here to other minority groups, be they racial groups or gender groups, and ask, to what extent assimilation is offered to open to all blacks or gays, or is it open mostly to privileged members of different minority groups? And to what extent, and this is obviously a huge debate within the African American community, to what extent does assimilation mean denying part of who you are? And to what extent does it mean self-hatred against blackness or gayness in a way that you see people who embrace a black culture or a gay culture or other cultures as leading towards racism or homophobia or, in this case, anti-Semitism? So I think these are important issues that Arendt is here raising about Jews, that she will, in some of her writing, attempt to expand and apply to questions of race relations in the United States and others. Doing so got her into a lot of trouble, as some of you know. This is one of the questions we'll be discussing at our conference coming up on October 10th and 11th at Bard on racism and anti-Semitism. One of the real questions we have is, to what extent does Arendt's understanding of an analysis of race, of anti-Semitism, allow her to have any kind of insight into racism that is interesting or helpful?
I wanted to jump in because I've been thinking about this a lot as we've been reading this, is that Rahel sees her being an outsider always in terms of being a Jew, and apparently not ever in terms of being a woman. And so you're bringing that up as these other areas. Two other women of somewhat similar time period, Mary Wollstonecraft in England and Madame Roland in France, both went through just unbelievable hell trying to participate in life as a whole person. So to me, reading this is a little frustrating that there's never any, well, I think Arendt says somewhere that Rahel never sees herself even as part of a larger picture at all. Even as a Jew, she takes it personally. So perhaps that is just her failing.
I think it's a good point. And, Rahel was certainly no feminist. She found access to society through being a woman, either through marriage or through having a salon. And so she didn't rebel against the avenues open to women. And so you're right. She was not. These are not issues she raised, and to a large degree, Arendt doesn't raise much either in her work. It's one of the reasons she's been often has been not universally, but has been criticized by feminist philosophers. Arendt doesn't make this a big issue.
There's, in case you're interested, Adrian Rich wrote a pretty memorable critique of Arendt's absence of addressing the woman question, and Shayla Ben-Habib has a nice essay an academic essay, but it's very readable in the Journal of Political Theory from I think it's from the 80s on Rahel Varnhagen and the question of feminism, which is worth reading. She's an excellent Arendt scholar. Just in case you want to look at what's out there.
Could you send us a link or a little more than that so I can look for it to that article?
So the title of the article is "The Pariah and Her Shadow."
This is the article by Ben-Habib, by Ben-Habib, "The Pariah and Her Shadow."
Yeah.
You can also find Shayla Ben-Habib's writing on this. Go ahead.
Oh no, I was just gonna, her book, The Reluctant Modernism of Hannah Arendt, also addresses it, but the Adrian Rich essay is from her book on Lies, Secrets, and Silence. And she talks about Arendt's conception of work and women in the moment.
There's a lot written on Arendt and feminism. There's been many books of essays on it. And I should say that a lot of feminists find great feminist resources in Arendt. But there's also no doubt that she's not a traditional feminist. And so you won't see her emphasizing the feminist aspect of someone like Rahel, who I don't think was a feminist either.
But she's also.
Well, I think it's a question of
Go ahead, Susan. Let Susan go, and then we'll come in.
She's also so critical of Rahel for not being who she is, and so she, on the one hand, isn't going to make a case for her, as a woman, but on the other hand, I mean, I don't know if anybody could be who they were in society as we've been talking about, but certainly for women, that would have been just unbelievably difficult. So she criticizes her for it in a way without supporting her, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Samantha, did you want
to? Yeah, just to respond to Susan. I mean, she criticizes her for it. I always find that there's something almost idealistic in Arendt's ignoring of the woman question. In her famous interview with Günter Gauss, he asks her, and so let's turn now to the question of women's liberation. Has this been a problem for you? And she says, of course. It's always been a problem as such, but what am I, I'm still going to do my work. She said, I've always done what I've wanted to do. And, it's kind of in the late 80s, in the kind of the Judith Butler turn in feminism, it became very popular to make the argument that feminism shouldn't proceed from womanness, that we should not have feminism emerging out of the idea of what a woman is, but a feminism should be a set of practices. It should be an orientation toward being in the world. And I think, Arendt, she doesn't address the woman question as such in that way, but in the way that she was in the world was, strikingly feminist, especially for the time that she's working and writing, the first woman appointed to teach at Princeton, the circles that she traveled in where she was publishing, who she was corresponding with. She had access to a world that was very closed to women in the 50s and 60s. And so I think, by the time second wave feminism in the States was, going, and you have people like Adrian Rich reading The Human Condition, they're like, what the hell? How can you talk about labor and not talk about the condition of women laboring in the household? you know? And, you know, there's a great frustration there. And so that led to a lot of secondary work on Arendt as, you know, trying to redeem Arendt as a woman who wasn't a feminist. But I think I'm not willing to say, I mean, it depends on how you think about the word feminism. You know, Arendt was a different kind of woman.
Can I
In
interject something here?
go ahead,
I
Jen.
had something to say about that, of course. When I read that, I've always done what I wanted to do when he asks her about the woman question. That is an issue that I hear all the time today. And it's usually with women who, the issue comes in with childbearing or or being a parent and being a female. And what avenues are open to you? Because as you came of age, even through the 80s, like I can remember going into every single movie studio I worked in the 80s, there was no daycare center. So it was harder for a female to walk into that role and see, oh, I can be a parent and I can still work here. You had to choose one or the other. And I often found that when women chose one or the other, they were either locked out or they were welcomed in if they moved on that male road to acceptance. And if you moved on that male road, then you could say, well, I've always done what I wanted to do. But did you really? Did you make a choice early on because society was as it was? I mean, all this stuff right now of everybody's, you know, pushing childbirth, they're not having kids, they're waiting till later. It's like, well, we had a women's movement and nobody wanted to put a daycare center in a business. So maybe we're at where we are because we didn't deal with that issue. So when I saw the interview that I love in the black dress, the little flower, which is very feminine, and she has pantyhose. And I was just checking
And
out
the
this
cigarettes.
whole
Don't forget
scene.
the cigarettes.
And she's saying, she kind of is dismissing the women's movement, but here she is in this feminine way. It absolutely fascinated me, the image. And it angered me a little bit too. I'm not going to deny that.
Just Jennifer,
Well,
let me.
wait, just one second. In that
Go.
same interview, I think one of the most amazing lines she had is when he asks her if she considers herself a philosopher. And she says, why would I want to belong to that group of old men? I just thought that was very brilliant because I think that was her type of feminism.
Yeah, I mean, just to say, Arendt, when she talks about the Black Power movement and the student movements on campus in the 60s, you know, one of the things that's fascinating is she's all in favor of the political movement around it, asking for and demanding political changes. So I'm thinking of what Jennifer was just saying, childcare on, you know, in radio stations or at universities or at places of work. She sometimes disagrees with some of the changes they're asking for, like she doesn't think there should be, you know, an cultural studies program or something like that. We can agree or disagree with her. I'm not interested in getting into that debate. But she's all in favor of political activization around political interests, in this case, interests of people who have children, which are not just women. There are men who have children. There are, you know, two gay parents who have children, male gay parents. And I mean, I think the point is she would take it out of pure identity politics and put it into political interests around having children or other socioeconomic and situational needs. And she would be all in favor of that kind of political organization. And so that kind of feminism, I think she would support. And so I just think it's important for us to understand that aspect of it. Sam, did you want to add something here or not? Okay. Unless there's other questions, I thought it might be worthwhile to take a look at the passage on near the beginning of the civil improvement chapter. It's a paragraph beginning later when her marriage with Varnhagen. It's going to be about 219, 220, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, 26. 226 in one edition, 149 in my edition. Later, when her marriage with Varnhagen had already become so much. Anyone find that?
225 it is, Roger, on ours. 225.
And 184 on the other one.
Okay, great. 184, 225. So I don't know. I found this passage really fascinating. Later, when her marriage with Varnhagen had already become so much a matter of course, I thought that was a fascinating formulation. That she could only think to assign the name of love to it. Again, you know what it made me think about? It's funny. Is Fiddler on the Roof when Golda asks Tevye, "Do you love me?" Or he asked her, "Do you love me?" And she's like, "I don't know. Do I love you? I guess I do." After all these years of marriage, I just thought it was a fascinating formulation. Later, when their marriage with Varnhagen had already been so much a matter of course that she could only think to assign the name of love to it, she actually believed that passion required muteness. That's the point I wanted to talk about, that passion required muteness and a lack of understanding in order to come into being. No sort of attachment, no well-wishing, no amount of perception is ever called passion, heart's pain, inner rending, not when the object of choice is so sensible that one can talk with him, so rational that one can tell him everything. The less she desired or was able to become entangled in passion, the more determined she was to have her peace. The idea that passion requires muteness and a lack of understanding, I think, is one of the themes of this book. I mean, Sam has said a number of times that this is a anti-romantic book or anti-romanticism book. And I don't think that's wrong. And yet, I don't know, Sam, you tell me. Lines like this make me less sure.
What page is it on, Roger?
184 or 225, depending on your edition. Later, when her marriage with Varnhagen.
Had already become so much a matter of course that she could only think to assign the name of love to it. Well, I mean, but that's a different kind of.
Go on. She actually believed that passion required.
She actually believed that passion required and a lack of understanding in order to come into being. No sort of attachment, no well-wishing, no amount of perception can ever become heart's pain. Inner rending called passion, not when the object of choice is so sensible that one can talk with him, so rational that one can tell him everything. The less she desired or was able to become entangled in passion, the more determined she was to have her peace.
So this strikes me, I mean, this is Rahel, and this is Rahel as a romantic. I mean, I think. So what's your, I just wonder, this doesn't seem like Arendt critical of Rahel on this count, but maybe you see it differently.
I think I hear what you're saying, but that's not what I'm talking about Romanticism is a philosophical movement. It's not Romanticism. And, part of the philosophical movement of Romanticism that's held up in figures like Goethe and Fichte and these, this circle of poets that Rahel initiated in a certain way that come into play here. Part of that is the sentimentalism of interpersonal relationships that we might associate with a romantic mood today. But the other side of that romanticism, and what I see Arendt being gravely critical of here in her reading of Rahel Varnhagen, is the kind of thinking that it initiates the subject into. Romanticism forces us to turn inward upon the self, philosophically speaking. And in that turning inward, it's a turning away from the world of plurality. So that even when we're with others in the private realm, in the social realm, or in the public realm, we're really still just with ourselves because we're engaged in this kind of relentless process of introspection. And for Arendt, that's very dangerous. And so
Absolutely.
I hear, I think, in this passage, she's kind of, maybe it's a play, she's looking at the romantic interludes in Rahel's life to illustrate her point about romanticism. And it's, both very sexy in a certain sense because we're getting all the dirt on her failed relationships. And, we have this kind of almost angry, critical language that Arendt is throwing at Rahel. But we also have Arendt constantly pulling our attention back toward assimilation, back toward the historical moment Rahel's living in, back to Jewish identity and the way Jews understand themselves as individual beings in the world, in a community with others, right? And it's ultimately going to be a different kind of reflective thought that redeems Rahel in the final chapter, that yanks her out of this self-obsessed, inward-looking romanticism, where she's able to accept her own plurality as a person in the world.
Yeah, I think that's right. And you can all, if you're interested, go back and relook at chapters 1 and 2 of the book, where we really talked a lot about this mania for introspection, which Arendt found in Rahel, and her desire to flee the world, which was one of plurality and difference and difficulty, and create her own life, which can be romantic, but is also, I think, actually in Arendt's reading, often quite enlightenment based, insofar as it sees us as sort of a kind of abstract self that is abstracted from our accidents and our particularities, and Rahel's desire for assimilation is, I think, part and parcel of that mania for thinking, which we read about in the first and second chapters, where she tries to think herself out of her particularities and her and the plurality of the world, including her Jewishness. So it is, unless there's a final last comment, we are a lot of us have to go prepare for holiday meals. I have to make some latkes. And I want to wish you all a very happy holiday if you're celebrating anything. And we will reconvene in 2 weeks with the penultimate chapter to the book on between Pariah and Parvenu. One of the more famous actual chapters Arendt wrote. It's a short chapter. But I think there'll be a lot to talk about. So enjoy your holiday, enjoy reading Hannah Arendt, and we'll see you in 2 weeks. Thank you all very much.
Thank you all.
Thank
Bye,
you.
everyone.
Thank you,
Bye.
Roger.